Thank you very much for that introduction. I am delighted to be here and to have the opportunity to address this group talking about economic progress, the role of government. Now, if we're really going to understand the role of government in economic progress, the first thing we need to understand is what generates economic progress. And in a word, entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship generates economic progress. I have here on the slide a picture of Joseph Schumpeter, that great 20th century Austrian economist. If you know even a little bit about Schumpeter, you're probably familiar with his most famous phrase where he talked about creative destruction, that process where the new comes in and displaces the old. One of the distinctions that Schumpeter made when he was talking about the process of economic development, he distinguished invention from innovation. Invention is the science, it's the technology that lies behind economic progress, but Schumpeter emphasized the importance of innovation. It's bringing those inventions to market to have a profitable product. And if we're thinking about the role of entrepreneurship in economic progress, it's the innovation that leads to economic progress, not necessarily the invention. It's great to have a lot of advanced technology, but the role of innovation is to bring that technology to market with a marketable and profitable product. And just a little anecdote about that. You may know Fred Smith, who was the founder of Federal Express, the package delivery company. Now, there's a company that uses a lot of high-tech aircraft, warehouses, not so high-tech, trucks, and of course they have a very sophisticated logistics system. And you may know that Fred Smith, when he was earning his Master of Business Administration degree, proposed creating that company as one of his projects when he was a college student, a master's student. And he got a B on his project. The professor said, it's a very interesting project, but really he was supposed to come up with something that was feasible. So that just shows you academics aren't always in a good place to understand what is innovation. And I will say, most people aren't in a good situation to understand what a good, profitable innovation will be. That's why you need to have a market system that gives opportunities for lots of companies to start up, lots of companies to give their ideas a try. If you go back and think about the United States economy back in the 1960s, when you think about what were the innovative companies back in the 1960s, IBM, maybe one of the most innovative, maybe the most innovative company in the world back in the 1960s, General Motors, and so as we look ahead, these days we think about companies like Apple, companies like Facebook, companies that didn't even exist back then. So if we're thinking about an entrepreneurial economy for Korea, of course we want to consider the firms that are already in existence. IBM is still around, General Motors is still around, but if you know a little bit about the history of those companies, IBM ran into a lot of problems in the 1990s. Some financial observers thought IBM was likely to go out of business, declare bankruptcy in the 1990s. And General Motors actually did declare bankruptcy. So when we're looking ahead, we can look to the successful companies in Korea today. But if we're thinking about an entrepreneurial economy for the future of Korea, we ought to not be thinking about how can we strengthen the IBMs and the General Motors of the Korean economy. We want to be thinking about how can we develop the new Apples, the new Facebooks in the Korean economy. Think about that concept of creative destruction that Schumpeter talked about. And here, you look at Kodak. Now, Kodak, for a century, was the dominant firm in its industry, in photography, in film production, but Kodak wasn't looking ahead to the digital revolution, and so from being such a profitable, long-standing company, Kodak has fallen on hard times. So if we're thinking about the Korean economy today, we need to be thinking of, there's some great companies in the Korean economy today, but you need to ask the question, are they ready for the developments of the future? And it doesn't necessarily have to be those economies that we're seeing today that are ready for the future. The Korean economy needs to be an incubator so that not only will it develop its IBMs and its General Motors for the future, but Korea will be the economy that has the new Apple, the new Facebook, companies that are coming up with new products, new innovations, things that a lot of people haven't even thought about yet. So we look at Korean economy today, and there are a lot of very productive firms in the Korean economy today, but it's a pretty concentrated economy. If you look at the 10 largest chaebols in the Korean economy, they make up 80% of Korean GDP. So when you're thinking about startups, when you're thinking about innovation, at least the way the Korean economy is structured today, it's not really structured in a way that's very conducive to, let's say, startups. It may be conducive to innovation. You look at companies like Samsung. Samsung is a pretty innovative company. But at the same time, I don't know, do you think that the Samsung Galaxy has had a better phone than the iPhone? But the point of my question isn't whether it's a better phone or not. The point is, it was Apple who developed that product, and Samsung's done a pretty good job of developing a good competing project. But what you want to think about in the Korean economy is not how a company like Samsung can match or maybe do better than the products that Apple is making. Hyundai makes great cars. They've got a lot of market penetration in the United States. I'm seeing Hyundais on the road all the time. But what you want to think about for the Korean economy is not, can Hyundai make a better car than General Motors? You want to think about, where are those companies going to come from that are going to come up with the new innovative products? In the past, the Korean economy has had a lot of government oversight, government intervention in the economy. Koreans have been pretty successful in developing using an industrial policy. And I know over the decades, the Korean economic policy has evolved from where it was in the 1960s, 1970s, but nevertheless, the Korean economy has had a pretty heavy hand from the government. And industrial policy can be pretty successful when the government looks at firms that are already entrepreneurial, that are already succeeding in the global economy. And this is one way I would see the industrial policy of Korea in the 1960s and 1970s, looking at firms that already have gotten a good start, firms that are already entrepreneurial. But a problem when the government supports firms, when the government helps out firms to develop their market presentation, market penetration, is that increasingly those firms become more and more dependent on the government support rather than their own innovative activity. And so you get a situation where companies are increasingly looking for government support as opposed to thinking, how can I develop an innovative product in the market? That can be a problem when you have too much government intervention in an economy, and especially when that government intervention shows favoritism to some firms relative to others. Professor Sumata gave a very interesting presentation when he talked about Tokyo-style companies versus Kyoto-style companies. And if you look at Samsung, if you look at Sony, are those Kyoto-style companies or Tokyo-style companies? Well, I think the idea of the professor's talk was Sony tends to be a Tokyo-style company. Samsung, Tokyo-style, Kyoto-style company. Partly we should care about that. We want Samsung to be innovative. But again, I emphasize that thinking back to the IBMs and the General Motors of the U.S. economy, if we look ahead a decade or two in the Korean economy, you want to have the opportunity for new firms to emerge, for the new Apples, for the new Facebooks, for the new Googles to be Korean companies. If we look at the source of Korean economic progress, I mean, Korea has come so far since the 1960s. And how did the Korean economy do that? Well, I've sort of distilled this down into three things. First of all, Korea had low wages. That was an advantage at one time, but no more as the wages and incomes of Korean workers have gone up. Now it's Vietnam, Thailand, China. Those are the low-wage countries. Adopting foreign technology. And again, Korea has adopted foreign technology and developed foreign technology. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, but I've already mentioned to you a little bit Schumpeter's distinction between invention and innovation. And you want to be the innovators, not necessarily the inventors. So adopting foreign technology is not necessarily a bad strategy. Again, go back to the example of Federal Express. You know, Fred Smith with his company Federal Express is doing a great job using aircraft to ship packages all over the world. But he didn't invent the airplane. He thought there's a better way to use this that is a great profit opportunity. And then, again, selling into foreign markets. So when we're thinking about adopting foreign technology, it's okay. Technology can be adopted. It can be homegrown. I think sometimes in our educational systems, we emphasize too much the science, the technology, the engineering, and not enough the innovation, innovative thinking that leads to economic progress. Because really, if we're thinking about economic progress, it's the innovation, not necessarily the invention, that generates economic progress, that generates prosperity. Let me just mention the CEOs of 3 American companies. I want to ask you, what do these 3 people have in common? Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple. Bill Gates, who founded Microsoft. Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook. One thing they all have in common is none of them graduated from college. So, but they were the innovators, right? They could take the innovation, they could take the inventions of other people, and they could use them to innovate. I'll just give you a few examples here. Apple didn't invent the graphical user interface. That was invented at Xerox. And Xerox never made a profitable product using the graphical user interface. So Xerox was the inventor. Apple and Microsoft were the innovators in that market. So if you're thinking about economic progress and you want to generate economic progress, is it better to be Xerox, the inventor, or is it better to be Apple and Microsoft, the innovators? And I might emphasize here also that innovation is always risky. What we tend to do, I have a few slides here coming up in a row that emphasize the winners. Another one, Henry Ford. He didn't invent the assembly line, but nevertheless, he saw assembly line production in other industries and saw that this was a way to produce a profitable product. But it was a risk. In fact, all of these ventures are risks because people are doing things that nobody's ever done before. Ford speculated if he manufactured automobiles on assembly lines, he could make enough of them cheap enough that it would be a profitable business. But there's no way he could know that because nobody had done that before. And we focus on the successes, but in order to have an innovative entrepreneurial economy, you need to give people a chance to try out their ideas. Some of them will be successes, like Henry Ford and Steve Jobs. Some of them will be failures. And I think sometimes we emphasize the successes too much so that we don't see that there are successes and there are failures. Andrew Carnegie didn't invent the Bessemer process for steel, but he created U.S. Steel, again, great entrepreneurship. Ray Kroc didn't invent the fast food restaurant. He saw this little restaurant, McDonald's, and said, hey, here's a real profit opportunity. So the McDonald brothers started up a restaurant, but it was Ray Kroc who was the entrepreneur who saw the profit opportunity in that restaurant. Economic progress comes from applying new ideas to bring better projects to market. So invention is a great thing, but it's innovation that leads to economic progress. And so here, if we're thinking about invention versus innovation, if we're thinking about adopting foreign technology, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Because it's not the invention that leads to economic progress, it's the innovation. Selling into foreign markets was another thing that the Korean economy had done. And I think, obviously that's a way for economic development. But again, I think when you look at Korean economic policy, when firms rely too much on government support, they lose their incentive to be innovators. We need to have a level playing field. So what is it that leads to economic progress? And here I have a list of things here that came from the Fraser Institute's annual report, the Economic Freedom of the World report. So the Fraser Institute puts out an index of economic freedom where countries are ranked by number. And there are more than 40 indicators that are grouped into 5 areas. And the better you do, the higher your score on the Economic Freedom Index. Higher scores are correlated with higher incomes, and improvements over time in that index are correlated with income growth. So what are those 5 areas that the Korean economy needs to focus on in order to have economic progress? Limited government, limited taxes and expenditures, so a small public sector helps, rule of law and protection of property rights, stable monetary policy, freedom in international trade, and low regulatory barriers. Those are the 5 areas that the Economic Freedom Index looks at. The countries that do better in that index are more prosperous. So how does Korea fare in the Fraser Institute's index? Korea ranks 39th. I put here on this slide the top 5 countries in the world. I've also included the United States, which comes in at 16th in the index. Japan is 26th. And then I've included a number of countries here on the slide that are close to Korea. When we look at these areas of the Economic Freedom Index, what we see is size of government. Government spending in Korea has gone up. In 1970, it was 18.6% of Korean GDP. Today, 32%. Still not that high, but nevertheless, you can see even as the Korean economy has grown, the share of that economy going through government also has grown. Tax rates are relatively high, and so here's an area where lower government spending, lower taxes can help entrepreneurship. The legal system and property rights, I think this is a big one for Korea. Rule of law, South Korea ranked 47th in this component of the index. And I think Korea has had a history of cronyism, a history of favoritism, gosh, I think we're going to have a presidential election coming up here soon because of maybe some problems related to this. So, but this goes back well before President Park, and so an objective system, a legal system, rule of law where everybody's subjected to the same rules, everybody plays under the same rules, that will enhance the Korean economy. Sound money, Korea's pretty good. It ranks 19th, but still pretty good here. That is low inflation, low variability of the inflation rate. Freedom to trade internationally is another component. Here, Korea ranks 75th in this component. And indeed, Korea's had a history of protectionism. Korean firms today, we know, are large enough that they can compete in world markets without government assistance. In fact, government assistance is a hindrance because companies rely increasingly more on government support as opposed to looking for ways to be creative and entrepreneurial to stay on top of things. So one argument against government interference in trade, the trade barriers, tariffs, favoritism. One argument against is Korean firms are already big enough. They don't need that help. But another argument is you look at some of these innovative firms that we've mentioned, American firms, Google, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook. These companies didn't have government assistance, and now they've grown to be some of the largest companies in the world. And the final area in the index, regulation, again, South Korea doesn't rank very well, 95th in this area. The only reason to have regulation is, first of all, to prevent people from doing things they otherwise would choose to do, or second of all, to require them to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. To prevent them from doing things they want to do, or to require them to do things they don't want to do. Now, if you think about the way free markets work, why not let people decide for themselves what they want to do rather than have government regulation? So Korea scores relatively low here. Labor market regulations, business regulations. So if we want to have growth and prosperity in Korea, let's turn inventions into innovations. You need to provide the framework that gives people an incentive, not only the existing companies, give startups an incentive, give people with an idea the incentive to say, I can start a business to produce this good or service that I think people would want. And in order to remain competitive in global markets, Korean firms should be subject to global competition, not protected from it. So again, looking at that economic freedom index, what can Korea do if we look at government policy? Reduce government spending, lower taxes, rule of law is a crucial thing, improve the independence and impartiality of the court system, and deregulate. So if we think ahead to Korean economic policies, I mean, what kind of policy do we want to have in Korea that leads to prosperity and continued economic growth? Industrial policy, government control over the economy? I don't think that's a good way forward. There's been in the past some talk about economic democracy. Hey, a few people have profited so much from the system, let's spread the wealth to workers and so forth. But that's just favoring a different group. Government policy shouldn't really be favoring anybody. The most productive government policy to have is a government policy that treats everybody the same under rule of law. That's the route for a productive Korean economy. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm just delighted to have been invited to be here.
네, 홀공 교수님께서는 그 정부의 역할이 재정립될 필요가 있다 하는 점에 강조를 주신 것 같습니다. 먼저 그 발명과 혁신을 구분하신 것 같습니다. 발명이라는 것은 없던 것을 만드는 것이고, 혁신은 그 아이디어를 가지고 제품을 그 시장에 팔 수 있는 것을 만드는 것이다, 이렇게 말씀하신 것 같은데, 이제 정부는 그동안의 혁신을 주도하고 이길 산업을 선택하는 역할을 하면 안 된다. 그 정부는 이런 혁신적 환경을 만들어야 한다, 이런 말씀하신 것 같고, 혁신적 환경 중에 중요한 것은 한국 상황에서는 특별히 국제무역의 그 여러 가지 규제를 완화시킨 것과 한국의 규제 완화를 요청하셨습니다. 그러면 두 번째 발표자 우리 보이보대 교수님의 그 독일 사례를 들어보도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.